Hello. Can everybody hear me? Great. So my name is Dua, and I know what you all are wondering. Yes, like Dua Lipa, exactly like Dua Lipa. So first of all, I want to kind of give everybody here a round of applause for joining a session about standardizing UX research on a Wednesday after lunch. I mean, I know that doesn't sound like the most exciting topic, so you all deserve a round of applause for that effort. So just to kind of go through things fairly quickly, my name is Dua, like I mentioned. I'm a researcher at Square, specifically the Square banking research team. So we're kind of separated out. I have a background in academic research and then also a background in operations, specifically in UX research operations, where I started at Lyft and then transitioned into a researcher. So I have a bit of background on processes and standardizing things. So my experience will be coming from that perspective. And yes, again, I'm currently at Square, specifically Square Banking. So just to set expectations, before we kind of go through all this, there's no one-size-fits-all formula for developing and carrying out a research team, specifically within the context that I'm coming from, two fairly larger teams. So I know there's various contexts when it comes to research for folks. I'm coming to this from that context, and I just want to kind of set those expectations. And this deck is kind of just meant as a starting point to help you begin to articulate the kind of types of research and how to sort of prioritize and standardize those research practices within your company. So basic research, we know, is about talking to users, and everybody in the company should be empowered to talk to users. Within the Square banking context, it's sellers, it's small business owners. Talking to users and conducting research is essential to creating products that meet everyone's needs and having a greater chance of being adopted and a successful sort of feature launch or whatever that is. So, and ultimately setting up those processes allows everyone to benefit from talking to a user and kind of creating and building that connection to the user. So just kind of peeling back the layers, the first kind of basic, just to simplify that first layer, it's talking to a user. And that surface level way to learn about products and simply talk to a user and why they use the product, how they use the product, and who are they. That's that base layer that anybody can kind of do at the company. The next important aspect is to understand a user's needs, goals, and behaviors, to kind of dig deeper. And we want to understand specifically in Square banking what sellers' pain points are, what their goals for their business are. We're talking to a lot of small businesses and a lot of small business owners. And then ultimately, kind of like the sweet spot is to get to that center where we're understanding users' pain points and addressing them. And building empathy. The goal is to build that empathy for the seller or a user, depending on kind of who your ultimate user is. And that's kind of the crux of it, and where you really truly want to get to. How do you do that? Well, so research can be engaged, as many of us have probably seen this framework before, but research can be engaged at any point in the product development cycle, from discovery to launch. But for foundational research, generally we're learning about the solution, the people and the problem space. And then for generative research, we're going to be focusing more about prioritizing and solving those solutions, and then focusing more on the solution space. So at that stage, you're usually in the define or refine area for a product development. And then ultimately, when we're thinking about launching a product, we're thinking about that tactical research, the more evaluative research. So does our solution solve that problem, and how could it be even better? And so a lot of that ends up being the more tactical research, and some researchers may not find that as exciting, but it's just as impactful. And then research is not to be meant to be a one-off solution. It's a part of an overall process. As we see, we try to align it with product development. And ideally, we incorporate research both when we don't know what to do and when we know what to do. And how do we do that? How do we start to instill those processes within a company so that research is more normalized and the impact of research is more normalized. So, where you want to be and where it's okay to be. And again, this is coming from my perspective, where you want to be as a research team, and ultimately where it's okay for you to be as far as structure. So I'm just simplifying this a little bit, but at times, depending on your company, you might be the sole researcher, you might be a designer doing research, and so that's that first stage. And as things kind of grow, again, this is a vague representation of my experiences in different companies. As things get to grow, you might be a mid-sized team, you might have 2 to 5 researchers, but you're not fully embedded. You're still supporting various product teams, you're still trying to prioritize, you're still trying to figure out kind of the best project. And then the ideal scenario, which most researchers want, is to be a fully embedded researcher, with less context switching, where research and where you are, not switching from project to project. You're able to kind of go with a project through its full development. And again, to set a little bit more expectations, there are challenges with each stage. Obviously, a sole researcher would have very specific challenges as well, but there will be challenges in prioritizing research and standardizing research at each of these stages. And just out of scope for this presentation, I won't be going too deep into methodology. So this is kind of just to give a fair framework of kind of research and how it's structured. So with a sole researcher, I think that's probably the most challenging stage because there's parts of it has to do with educating your team on research, what's the right type of research. Maybe folks reach out for research that isn't necessarily meant for UX research. So there's a level of education that's associated with, being the sole researcher at a company. And having impact to ultimately drive growth. So that the ultimate goal of this sole researcher is to show the impact of research and to potentially continue to increase that headcount and grow that team. So part of that is prioritizing projects that will have that impact and also, ultimately delivering that impact. Where we'll focus today is my experience as a researcher at Square Banking. We're roughly 2 to 5 researchers right now. So there are challenges, but we do have a thriving research team, which is fantastic. We are also privileged enough to have an operations manager within the team, which is very essential for a research team because there are a lot of logistics associated with research, and I'm sure folks who have done their own research understand this. There's recruiting, there's logistics associated with vendors, so the challenges are quite a bit if you don't have somebody helping with the logistics and the operations side of things. So, at this stage, you may or may not have an ops person, but we do, luckily. And the challenges here are about balancing and prioritizing the right projects and consulting on other projects, potentially, and also making sure that you're choosing the right projects for those full-fledged, full-service projects. Where do we start? So, the 2 ways that we intake research are road mapping or potentially a research intake form. These are the 2 ways that we potentially get research in at Square. And with road mapping, that's usually sort of the ideal state, and obviously that depends on how full-fledged the road mapping process is with other folks at the company, and if that's, if there isn't any sort of ambiguity there. And then there's the research intake form, and we'll go a little bit deeper into that. So, with the research intake process, we want to obviously align the roadmap with the product roadmap. And this is, again, not a one-size-fits-all formula. So for us, it's quarterly. Folks could do it yearly if they feel that the roadmap would not necessarily change as much. But for us, we meet quarterly. And it will, again, depend on what stage of the product cycle you're in. So with Square, we have our stakeholder alignment process entails either a workshop or a meeting where you get all of the stakeholders in the room, and that's product management, design, whoever is involved, and we have everyone kind of list out the potential products that they'll have for that quarter. So, and then one of the benefits of doing it this way is that other folks are able to hear what other product managers are working on, and so they start to kind of almost prioritize in their heads, like, hey, maybe that project's a little bit more important than the one I'm working on. Maybe the researcher's time is better spent in that way. So it's pretty important to kind of have everybody in the room when you're going through this process. And again, getting everybody in the room is a challenge, but I think especially when you're prioritizing and setting up your research roadmap, it's ideal to have everybody in the room. And just to kind of look at this sheet right here, this is kind of the ideal output that you would have out of a roadmap. So you start to scope out the projects based on different aspects, and then that tab right here is what the ultimate roadmap ends up looking like. So you have your time allotted, you're able to show what you'll be working on specific months. You're able to share this widely so folks can see what types of work you're working on, and are able to understand why you may or may not be able to take on their project. And again, this is kind of like the ideal output you would get out of one of these meetings. But to get to this point, I'll get into that a little bit later, but in addition, the other way to potentially get research intake is through a research intake form. So the main reason for this is if potentially roadmaps change, this happens all the time, priorities change, this happens all the time as well. So to have this intake form available for folks to submit, instead of kind of just pinging you, hey, I need help with research, you're able to document it, you're able to understand what their needs are. So what we have, anybody can sort of submit this form, but the way that we have it is that they're able to kind of submit not only what the project is that they want to work on, but what the objectives are, what the ultimate solution or what they would ideally get out of this potential project. So we have that documented. We're able to prioritize ours as well. So that's this, in addition to the roadmap, is kind of how all the research is kind of taken in. And so what I just described is how you can kind of begin to identify projects. How do you scope projects? That's kind of the next challenge there. These inputs are a bit of a balancing act, whether the project came in during your roadmap process or it came in an intake submission process. How do you ultimately scope out and prioritize the projects that you actually end up working on? So first, you think about the purpose of the project. Consider whether this is tactical, low-level work, or strategic, higher level, potentially more impactful work, and where in the product development cycle this potential project is, whether, how it will ultimately be used, what kind of business decision it will be used for. So kind of considering all of that in the purpose. And then thinking about company priority. If this is a high company priority project, if it's low, where is this request coming from? Is it a higher level request? Is it a more lateral request? So thinking about that when you're thinking about scoping and prioritizing projects. Timeline. This is extremely important. Researchers have limited bandwidth depending on the types of research that they're thinking about. So thinking about timeline is very, very essential. And not only about timeline as far as your bandwidth, but timeline as to when this potential decision needs to be made by. So if you work on this project and the decision needs to be made yesterday, maybe this isn't the right project for you to spend your time on. So consider this, and then also consider the amount of time and resources the project might take away from other projects. So timeline is very essential when you're thinking about scoping and prioritizing these projects. And then, in addition, the level of involvement. So research can be involved in a few different ways, which we'll go over. But is somebody else going to be leading this? Is this, a project where we'll be reviewing? We'll just be needing review. how much involvement does research need in this particular project? And then finally, the priority matrix, which I'll also go over. But all of these, ultimately, these inputs contribute to the level of consideration. So if something is high priority but lacks purpose, or the timeline doesn't match with what you're thinking, that doesn't automatically mean that the research should be a consideration. Just because it's high priority doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right fit for research. So you have to kind of consider all of these aspects into the level of consideration when you're scoping out a project. So, in addition, I mentioned kind of the priority matrix, and this particular matrix I'm sure folks have seen in the past. One thing I do is that I make sure that my stakeholders are involved with helping me decide this, whether this project is high risk and has low clarity. That's the point where research should be heavily involved. If a project is low risk and low clarity, research should still very much be involved, especially if there's low clarity. And then these other two quadrants is where you sort of deprioritize research, especially if you're deciding between projects. And again, defining involvement can be impacted by this priority matrix. And what I mean by defining involvement is what I mentioned earlier, how research could be a full service level of involvement, or it could be where you're just the guidance / partner in a project, or you are just consulting, and potentially the stakeholder is doing the project on their own. So what I mean by self-serve is maybe a designer is leading the research and they just need review. Maybe this is a project with like guidance / partnering. A researcher will advise and approve the research plan, their questionnaire, making sure that, they're not asking biased questions, making sure that the proper research techniques are taken into consideration. And then that's the sort of the guidance / partnering level of involvement. But when you're thinking about a full service project, especially if you're a growing research team and you're thinking about, how I can grow this team and how much impact you want, that full service project is the most important project as to which one you're going to get involved with. So you really have to think about the full service project and think, really strategically and intentionally about the projects that you take on for full service. And when we talk about full service, we're talking about full on, taking on this project from recruitment, from all the logistics, creating the discussion guide, creating the research plan, and then synthesizing and ultimately reporting out the research. And then since, especially at Square, we're not a fully embedded research team, it's definitely important that we be intentional about the full service projects that we take on. So how does this work in practice? This particular project came up in our road mapping process, so this wasn't an intake. This didn't come in through an intake form. It came up in our road mapping process. But the question was, or at least what we wanted to focus on was, multiple teams wanted to better understand the needs, perceptions, and jobs to be done of upmarket sellers as it pertains to banking. So we met with stakeholders, and with this process, like I mentioned, it came in through road mapping, and it came through multiple stakeholders. So we know that it's a high priority project. We know that many people are thinking about it. So when we're thinking about kind of this framework of helping scope out projects, we know that the purpose is meant to build strategy and meant to sort of help continue to build out the roadmap for the future. So it's purposeful and intentional. And then with company priority, we know it's a high priority project. So we know that it is kind of higher level in that decision-making process. The timeline matched up because one important thing that they brought this during the road mapping process. So we're able to make sure that we have the bandwidth for this project and it wasn't kind of brought in through an intake process. And then level of involvement, just based on the needs of the project, we know that we would have to have a higher level of involvement. And then for the priority matrix, we know that this is high risk. And then we know also that there's low clarity on what our upmarket sellers need. So this kind of hit each bucket when we were scoping as far as like the level of prioritization it needs for each of these aspects here in our inputs. So, like I said, we ultimately decided for this project to be prioritized and a full service project. So this project would require full service because of the complexity and the level of logistics it would require to have a researcher be involved in. So it was worth the researcher's time ultimately. So just to quickly kind of go over the project, this has less to do with kind of how we prioritize, but ultimately what this project was, it came in kind of 3 phases. We started off first by going through past research, so creating a repository of past surveys on upmarket sellers, any interviews that we had ever done with an upmarket seller, and we created a whole repository of that past research. We then did internal interviews with account management and sales and folks who already talked to upmarket sellers before actually talking to sellers. And we connected with data science and internal data. So we had this huge repository of all the information that we already have before conducting any research. And then we presented this data in a research deck and did a company share out, just as this first phase. And then we gathered stakeholders for this next kind of phase here, the question prioritization workshop. So we gathered stakeholders in the room, and we asked them what was left out from that first phase of research. We had them all create any open questions that they might have that weren't answered from this first phase of research. So we created those questions, and then we then prioritized those questions. So if folks felt that the questions that others brought up were a high priority, we then prioritized those as the questions we would then pursue in the next phase, which were the seller interviews. And we ultimately interviewed our upmarket sellers, and we had remote interviews. And so this is just to kind of give an idea of the phases of a project that would be a full service project that would require logistics, that would require a lot of legwork to kind of go into. So lastly, some other practices to kind of build out. I went through kind of like the road mapping process and how to kind of scope and prioritize these projects. In addition, I went through kind of like a foundational project right before this, but evaluative research can be just as impactful and important. So especially in a team that you want to grow and you want to kind of catch those low-hanging fruit to be able to still have impact, those tactical and iterative projects ultimately can be a part of increasing headcount because we see the value and we see the way that the research has had impact. So you can be a major contributor to just justifying the increase of headcount, but it's small and meaningful to kind of have this space as a researcher. So all this to say, we think about research having impact and value, and we sometimes sort of make that synonymous with those full-fledged foundational projects, but those evaluative projects can be just as important. This is a bit, but this is just to kind of give a quick understanding of a research toolkit. So like I mentioned, some mid-sized teams already have research ops, so they're able to kind of help with creating those best practices docs, creating a recruitment process. But when you're a mid-sized team or even a sole researcher, it's kind of all hands on deck. So, when you go through a process, you then kind of create those best practices docs so the next person doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's kind of the way that we go through it with Square Banking. So again, research ops is very important here, but if there isn't a research ops person, there's always room to be able to kind of create those documents. Another very important aspect, especially if you have folks who aren't researchers in your company doing research, is to kind of create these templates so folks have a starting point to be able to create those research plans. One important thing before is that standardized survey question bank. So we don't want folks reinventing the wheel when it comes to survey questioning. So having that template for folks to reference. And then that research plan, research brief is really important. The way I distinguish a research plan and a research brief. So with a research brief, I'll usually have stakeholders actually create that first. They may have context that I don't have. And so that research brief is a way for us to get a better understanding of like what the objectives of a project and what their already existing assumptions or hypotheses are. And then I go ahead and create a research plan from that. So that's kind of my distinction for the research plan, research brief. And then a discussion guide template is also very important to kind of have a good template for folks to use when creating their discussion guide for interviews. So they're asking the questions in a intuitive way and in a way that it makes sense to be able to approach a user with. And the other really important template is our note-taker template and our note-taker sign-up sheet. So note-taker template is meant for folks who want to participate in sessions that may not be researchers, just want to kind of hear from our users. So you don't necessarily want many people in those sessions. So we have a note-taker sign-up sheet. And that also kind of helps folks kind of be a part of the process, a part of the research process. Involved with kind of the research plan from start to finish. So that's really integral. And finally, onboarding research tools and vendors is important as well, especially if you're not a full-fledged embedded team. There are times where there's important projects that you can't take on. So to kind of have that vendor in the back of your toolkit by onboarding them beforehand is integral. So, and when I mean by vendors, I'm thinking about recruitment tools. So, at times you might not be able to recruit internally. So being able to kind of pull out a recruitment vendor for potential research. Diary study platforms are fantastic. Surveying tools, and then qual and quant partners to help with research that you may or may not be able to take on. And then finally, this is very, very important because research visibility is integral to potentially have your team continue to grow. So creating sort of that visibility can be done through research decks, research readouts, and particularly at Square Banking, we have live streams for our readouts. So it's anybody can join, anybody at the company can join, and creates that larger visibility and that excitement around research. And then we also have a research newsletter, which is sent out quarterly, that allows folks to kind of see the research that we've been completing throughout the quarter. And finally, the most important is the research repository. Can't tell you how many times I get messaged about a particular question or a particular area that folks want to conduct research in that has already been conducted. So that research repository is fantastic to have as a reference for folks who may want to complete research that's already been done. So it's a great, these aspects here are great for sort of evangelizing research and making sure that we're advocating for research at the company. And ultimately, sort of the end goal from doing all of this is to be a fully fledged embedded researcher. I don't know many teams that are. I think most researchers are prioritizing and supporting many different teams. But ideally, your team grows, and instituting these practices lands you here as a fully embedded researcher. And just to kind of, before we end things off, I think I wanted to kind of highlight some of the benefits of being a fully embedded researcher. You're able to actually be a part of building the product from start to finish, and you're able to kind of re-reference your research and not jumping from project to project. There's definitely less context switching. And as a researcher, you're able to stay motivated because in an embedded model, you're able to make sure the research findings are translated effectively. So ideally, in the end, we have that fully fledged embedded researcher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dua. Just everything you said totally resonates, especially research repositories. Can't tell you how many times I've had research teams or just anyone in the company, they start a new research project that's already, someone did the same thing about a few months ago. And also, there's been times I've brought research ops on before just to kind of like get people doing it, and it's such a relief for the researchers. So amazing talk. We have a few minutes for questions, so I think you all know the drill. So I'm just gonna, here, I'll be soft. I'll be soft.
Hey, I wanted to ask about the best practices doc that you mentioned. We don't do anything like that. What would that include? Like, what type of information would that include? And yeah, how would that be
so
shared?
what I meant by that was just creating best practices as far as, this is the first time I'm running this kind of a survey. This is the first time I'm running a Kano survey. So let's create a best practices doc for that, for the next researcher who may want to kind of run a survey similar to that, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel, like I mentioned. It could be anything. It could be any new project you're kind of embarking on, to document it as soon as you just went through it, because all that time that you spent figuring things out does not need to happen for the next person around.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think right here. Did you have a question?
Hi.
Hi.
That was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. For research teams that are just getting established or starting out, do you have a tool where that you would recommend for a research repository? We have research coming from a ton of different tools, and different people have access or don't have access, and we're really looking for a way to make that available to everyone.
Yeah, so there are definitely vendors you could reach out to that do that, but the simplest way is to just have a spreadsheet of, this is the research, this is the ultimately impact and deck that we had for this research, and then plopping it in a potential website for that the company internally has access to. And so that's kind of how we do it. And not only that, but there are ways to sort of, even in Google Drive, to kind of organize it in a way that everyone can have access to. So there's ways to be creative if you don't want to ultimately use a vendor. But I mean, spreadsheets is just fine to kind of have as a link for folks to kind of reference whenever they need.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, we have one right behind you.
Can you throw that?
Sure. Oh, wow.
I like that one. I really liked how you distinguished between the consulting model versus self-service. Like, you had 3 tiers. I was wondering if you could unpack that a little more. Like, what really distinguishes that consulting versus, wait, did I get this right? No, guidance. I'm sorry. Guidance versus consulting and self-service. Like, guidance and partnership, they seem similar to me, but they're obviously distinct. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so with self-service, I would say that the researcher has very limited involvement. It's purely kind of reviewing docs, adding a few comments here and there, making sure nothing crazy is happening, because we've all seen, some research that isn't ideal. So just making sure you have that visibility there. The consult partnership research is still very much heavily involved. It's just that it's all of the logistics and all of the leadership in that project is not on research. You're partnering almost 50-50 with another stakeholder, whether that's design or the product manager. That level is still has heavy research involvement. It's just not all on the researcher. Whereas that full service is all on the researcher, but you carry other folks with you in the process.
Really quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Do you have like an intake? Does part of that intake process? Do you define it as part of that?
Yeah. So part of that intake process, we had the level of involvement. So for some of those really high-level strategic or high-priority projects, you're more likely to kind of make sure that the research is either guidance or full service, and definitely not the self-serve. Yeah.
Cool. We've got time for one more. I think I saw right behind you.
Hi. Thanks for the lovely talk. It was very articulate. I'm curious, how do we draw healthy boundaries between what part of the research should a researcher be doing versus what should a UX designer be doing? Because research is a big part of even the UX process in terms of it's a skill in the designer's toolkit. And of course, it's a specialization for researchers. But I noticed you mentioned in your model there's self-serve and the different formats. As a designer, how do I decide when should I be going to a researcher versus when should I be doing it myself? And I'm more curious in the discovery phase.
Yes, that's a fantastic question and something that's very important. I think number one, in the road mapping process, that process is when a researcher kind of defines their level of involvement. So as a designer, it's important to kind of get researchers involved in what you're thinking about as far as discovery as early on as possible. So then you're able to know, do I have this researcher's time? Can they fully take on this project? And when we're talking about that self-service model, a lot of the times that is distinctly a designer's, most of the time it's a designer who's doing that because they don't have the researcher's bandwidth to kind of do more iterative types of research, and they just want a look on a few designs, and maybe it's not worth the researcher's time to kind of spend. So the short answer is a researcher will give you that level of how much they're going to be spending time on that through the road mapping process or potentially the research intake process. So the level of involvement is kind of the onus on the researcher to explain to the designer. And then even if the researcher is fully taking on the project, there's still a partnership there with the designer, creating the designs, making sure that the designs are adequate for whatever research that's going to be conducted. So there's still kind of a level of partnership there.
Awesome. We're right at time. Do it. Thank you so much. Amazing presentation. Give her a round of applause.